congratulations to all of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are celebrating their survival at cultural events around the country. And also thanks to all of those Australians who've shown respect for, yes, the fact of our survival through the terrible history that remains a burden for so many Indigenous people.
So it definitely feels like the tone of Australia Day has been changing over the past few decades. What do you feel about the tone of today now?
Apologies. Yes, I believe that Australians need to adopt the philosophy of respect and think deeply about the consequences of having Australia Day on the day of invasion, and consider the harm that it causes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I believe most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have done their part to build a nation, in historical times, often against their will as indentured labourers, but also by excelling in various endeavours. Just take any of our sports people, for instance, Adam Goodes, Ash Barty, and many others who've contributed in so many ways, both in sports and in their community work. In education, the wonderful Tom Calma is the Senior Australian of the Year this year. His work over almost 5 decades has resulted in programs such as anti-smoking, suicide prevention, the Close the Gap measure, a better understanding of racism as a result of his time as the Race Discrimination Commissioner. We have so many wonderful professionals in all the professional fields now, medicine, science, astronomy, law, and I don't think I've ever met an Indigenous person who isn't in some way wounded by the burden of colonialism. And we find so many ways to resist the celebration of this invasion by having cultural events, by celebrating our survival. So I am grateful to those Australians who show respect for our feelings on this day. And I am also grateful that there are breakpoints now. Changes are being made to the insistence by the previous government that all citizenship ceremonies were mandated on the 26th of January. Of course, the 26th of January is not the date that our nation was created. Our nation was created on January 1st, 1901, when the Westminster Act for the Australian Constitution came into effect. January 26th was historically New South Wales Day, and it celebrated the arrival of the First Fleet. I don't think this is a good foundation for a truly inclusive, unifying national day.
Do you believe many more Australians would be keen to change the date if there was a greater awareness of the reality of the history of the treatment of Indigenous Australians?
Yes, well, in the last year, the wonderful Rachel Perkins broadcast her 3-part series, The Australian Wars. And I don't think most Australians know much about the frontier histories. It's certainly not taught in schools. In fact, it's in most schools, it's banned. So this is very unfortunate because Australians have this glib view that Australia was settled peacefully. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's also a view that Australian Indigenous people did not fight for Australia, quote, quote. And so there's a resistance from the War Memorial to acknowledge the contribution of thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women in every war and campaign since the Boer War. Things are changing slowly, but we need to change our school curriculum. We need to educate Australians about the factual history of Australia, and we need to stop the lying. So this is why, of course, the Uluru Statement from the Heart proposes a voice, the Makarrata, which refers to treaties, and truth-telling. And the biggest lie, of course, is Australia Day. It's not the day that Australia was created. It was, as I said, January 1, 1901. And I think we can find an inclusive date, and I think we can start to tell the truth about Australia's history and show some respect for all the survivors of the frontier wars.
Which day would be more appropriate?
I don't really have a view on it. There are a number of very good suggestions. Some say NAIDOC Day, some choose other days in the year. It's not up to me. I think there ought to be a very considered government-led approach to ensure that all Australians are involved. Why would we want to celebrate our National Day on a day that celebrates the British arriving with 11 shiploads of convicts? That's probably called Convict Day, I expect, or Invasion Day, as so many Indigenous people say. January 1's probably not a good day. I've taught in classes in schools about this, and I've asked the students, do you think January 1 is a good day for Australia Day? And they will say that their parents wouldn't be awake to celebrate it. So I think the children have it right. May 26th, the anniversary of the referendum on including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the lawmaking powers of the Parliament and accounting us in the census might be a good choice. But, you know, as I say, I think there should be a process so that all views are heard.
Marcia Langton, you're a key figure in the effort to get a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice to Parliament with the referendum happening this year. How do you feel about where the public discussion is on that now?
Everybody's got a view. It might be that they don't know enough about it, and then there are those who are the advocates for it and those who are bitterly opposed. What we need to do is get more information out to the public so that they understand why the referendum is being held this year on the voice and why the voice is so important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and how having a voice will involve local communities in co-designing policies and programs that work to improve their communities. As the Minister said during the week, if there had been a voice, we wouldn't have the terrible problems in Alice Springs. The local people of Alice Springs must be listened to. They must have a role in designing the solutions to their problems there. But Alice Springs is not the only place with such problems. Many majority white communities have had these problems in the past. Take Newcastle or King's Cross or any number of towns that have faced the scourge of excessive alcohol use, public drunkenness and so on. And every community has its own way of dealing with these problems. And there are communities that have been very successful in solving their problems. I point to King's Cross, for instance. It's now relatively safe to walk through the streets of King's Cross and Potts Point. It wasn't only 10 years ago. It was an extremely unsafe area. And of course, this is where the one-punch laws came about because of the terrible public drunkenness and violence on the streets. So I think limiting alcohol is always a good idea. The alcohol industry has gotten away with pouring alcohol into vulnerable communities and convincing the public that it's not a health threat. It is most definitely one of the great risks to good population health outcomes. And everybody who works in a hospital will tell you that, especially the emergency departments. And wherever you have restrictions imposed, you see the entries into the emergency department fall. You see domestic violence assaults fall. So, and also you see general assaults decline in numbers, and it happens very quickly. And we saw this in Alice Springs when the banned drinkers register and the point of sale intervention by the police were introduced. The domestic violence rates dropped, as did other assaults. And as soon as the alcohol restrictions were completely lifted by the coalition government, the rates of assault skyrocketed, and the police lost control of the streets. So it's a good idea to have alcohol restrictions, but that's not the only solution to the problems in Aboriginal communities. And there'll be a lot of discussion about that today. Of course, what is needed is what we call in the health professions addressing the social and cultural determinants of health. And that means housing, education, employment, and various services that provide for the vulnerable, but particularly in the health field. So children are the most vulnerable in our community, and I urge Australians to think about how to provide for children, all children, and particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are the most disadvantaged, the most vulnerable, by giving them safe havens, ensuring that they have nutritious food, that they're safe at night, that they have places to recreate, that they are attending school, and enjoying life. Life is often far too hard for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and this should not be so in this wealthy country.
Yeah, and I was speaking to Pat Dodson about that the other day, and he was saying that particularly has to be a focus in those really remote communities. Just back to the referendum for a moment. You say the design of the referendum process has been elegant. You've written on that in the last couple of days, with a referendum working group and an engagement group to meet soon to advise on the finalisation of the question to be put at the referendum. But if the public discussion has already turned into a bit of an ugly mess now, politically at least, how can you describe the strategy as having been elegant when the strategy's ultimate goal is actually trying to bring people together to get this referendum through?
The proposal for a voice is an elegant solution to the conflict that we see certain politicians generating for their own political purposes. Imagine an Australia without these ugly fights about Aboriginal affairs. Why are we the football in politics far too often with so little result? There's no result from this conflict. This is why we need the voice, to take the politics out of good policy design, good consultation, good collaboration, good co-design, with local people having a say about matters that affect them. And as Linda Burney said, we wouldn't have the problems in Alice Springs if we had a voice, and this would be the case across the country. We will not be able to close the gap if we continue with this nonsensical political fighting on ideological grounds. Peter Dutton doesn't know anything about Indigenous affairs, and dare I say it, nor do the Greens. The Greens' policies are hopeless. So, and it's always a battle for local Aboriginal people to get what they want heard by politicians. So we learnt during the week, I was already aware of this, that in June, the Aboriginal Health Services and local leaders in Alice Springs wrote to a number of politicians pleading for the Stronger Futures legislation to be extended, or for at least the alcohol restrictions and other measures to be extended, so that they could consult with local people and come up with a solution to these problems. And they predicted that what we see now would happen. If they'd been given the opportunity to co-design with their communities, and this is a regional problem in Central Australia, solutions to these problems, rather than the dramatic and sudden end of alcohol restrictions, we wouldn't see the problems that we have now. Nobody listened to them. This is why we need the voice. And this is the case across Australia. I know of many communities who've been asking for, say, a new health clinic, or a youth centre, or a community centre. And these are dreadfully poor communities with very little infrastructure, and they're simply ignored. So I think every sensible Australian wants the political sting taken out of Aboriginal affairs and a sensible approach adopted. And nothing could be more sensible than the voice that has been proposed by our voice co-design process, and also by the Uluru Statement from the Heart gathering at Uluru in 2017. The question is very simple. Should there be a voice for Indigenous people to advise the Parliament? And there's more to the question. And this, of course, is now being refined by the Constitutional Working Group, and it will report to our referendum working groups. And there'll be more news in February after we meet. And I'm looking forward to seeing the revised question. It's very important that all of us see this revised question. Albanese, of course, announced it last year in July at the Garma Festival, but did make it very clear that it was a draft. There's been a lot of work done to get to this point. Over 30 years of thinking has gone into finding a way to stitch Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into what is essentially a colonial document, the Constitution, and provide dignity not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for all Australians, so that our Constitution doesn't remain a racist document. And it is most definitely a racist document. I challenge Australians to read their Constitution. They'll be shocked when they read Section 25, and if they know the history of Section 5126, they ought to be shocked by that too. It can be used by the Parliament to our detriment. That's a High Court decision. These are matters that need to be fixed.
And in the continuing discussion about the upcoming referendum, there's a talk for more detail from some quarters. What more clarification are you expecting from these working groups within the coming weeks?
The working groups will release information. We have a dilemma. If we release too much information, there are some politicians who will use that information and turn it into disinformation and start an argument about that. If we release too little, and there's mountains of information, but if we distribute too little information to the public, then people will feel that they're being conned. So we have to find the balance and find a way to communicate over 200 and something years of history, constitutional history, the legal, constitutional and moral reasons why the First Peoples of Australia should be acknowledged and recognised in the Constitution, why 3% of the population who are the most disadvantaged and yet have been here for 65,000 years ought to have a voice, a say in matters that affect them. Essentially, the question is a yes-no question. Do you agree that there should be a voice for Indigenous Australians to the Parliament? It's a yes-no question. People say, well, what will the voice look like? After that question is answered, there's the challenge of the Parliament grappling with the detail, drafting a bill and going through the parliamentary processes such as sending it out to committees for scrutiny, not only by parliamentarians but by the public. So the detail will be resolved in the parliamentary process. And that's the Australian parliamentary system. That's how our democracy works.
And considering where we're at now, we're just a little bit pressed for time, sorry for interrupting, but considering where we're at now with this discussion, where things are happening politically, Marcia Langton, are you still optimistic that this referendum, which is so important to you and important to so many Indigenous people, will actually succeed?
I'm always optimistic in life. The question is for Australians. Do you want a dignified, honourable place for Indigenous Australians in the national fabric? Do you want us to find ways to solve our own problems? The question is not to me. The question is to Australians, all Australians. It's a yes-no question. Should the First Peoples of Australia who've been here for 65,000 years have a say in the legislation that affects us?